Hi, today we are going to talk about three important functions. They are called awake, OnEnable, and start. These functions are special because they are recognized by Unity when they are defined inside a component. And when it sees them, it executes them at special times. Let me show you what I mean. For instance, I have two blue cubes, 1 and 2. There you go. And both of them are enabled, meaning the game object is enabled. And they also have this component that is also enabled. It's called the awake, OnEnable, and start. As you can see, this component has certain variables that are essentially default initialized. X is a float is 0, Y is an integer is 0, and these two are references. Ground is meant to be a reference to this other game object, and the mesh collider is a reference to the mesh collider component inside the ground object. There you go. Notice that we will in particular read the value inside ground's mesh collider of convex. So we expect it to be false because C is a Boolean, could be true or false, right? Because it's false, we expect that this component, awake, OnEnable, and start, we recognize it so. Why? Well, let me show you what it does. There you go. As you can see, we have this awake, OnEnable, and start component because it's a class that derives from mono behavior. So it can be used as a component. That's why we could drag and drop it onto the blue cubes. And there are these public data members, float x, int y, and the reference to the ground and the mesh collider component. And then we have awake. Awake, well, prints its own name and then initializes local data members, these ones. Does not initialize the references, okay? This is important. This is actually a good pattern to follow also for you. And then there is OnEnable that just prints its own name. Then there is start that also prints its own name, and then initializes the references, meaning the reference to the ground game object and the reference to the mesh collider component inside the ground game object. And then it prints through this reference to the component inside the ground game object the value of convex. So we expect that it prints mesh collider convex is false because we saw before that was unchecked, right? And then we also see that update checks if y is equal 1 to 3, and it is, right? Initially it's 1 to 3. Then it makes itself being 1 to 4, y becomes 1 to 4, and then it prints. This way, this debug log update is printed only once, because update prints, before every frame is rendered. So it would flood the console with all these debug logs. Instead, this way it only prints them once, okay? So what are the rules for awake, enable, and start? Well, awake is executed even when the component it is part of, in this case awake, OnEnable, and start, is disabled. As long as the game object it is part of is enabled, it will execute. So this is oftentimes called also a bootstrap function, because it's like a computer, right? You bootstrap the computer once during the day, maybe at the start of the day, and then doesn't matter how many times you run Photoshop, and then maybe you close it and then you reopen it. You don't rebootstrap the machine every time, right? Just because you are restarting Photoshop, you don't also reboot your PC or Mac, whatever. So you do it only once. So the game object is like your PC, whereas the application you are running is like your component. You only do the bootstrap once, so this is like the bootstrap. Again, awake doesn't care if the component is part of is enabled or not. As long as the game object is, it executes. Let's see what it means. Let's go back to Unity. We see that the game object is enabled and the component is enabled. Game object enabled, component enabled. So let's disable the components, just for fun of it. And let's press play. What we expect is that awake executes because even though the components are disabled, the game objects are enabled, and there you go. Okay? Now, because the components are disabled, update doesn't run. That makes sense, right? If disabled, update inside the component cannot run until it's enabled. Now, the moment we enable it, OnEnable start and the printing of mesh collider convex is false. That's correct, because look at that. Inside ground, the mesh collider component, the convex is false, right? So that was good. Now we enable it in one, and now we also enable it in the other one, and it will also trigger again. More update, OnEnable, start, and then again update. So when the component is enabled, in addition to the game object, OnEnabled and start are executed as well. That means that these two functions, OnEnable and start, are a little pickier. This one only requires the game object to be enabled. This one requires both the game object and the component to be enabled. And the same is true for start. So far, awake looks to be the outlier, the one that behaves differently, and OnEnable and start the same. But actually, there is a difference between these two. The difference is that start, like awake, is executed only once in the entire life cycle of the game object. Meaning, it doesn't matter if the game object goes disabled and then re-enable it again, and then disabled and enable. Awake and start only execute once, and that's it. Whereas enabled is more like the switch of the chandelier in a room. Every time you flick it on and off, the lights goes on and off. So is like start triggers when both the game object and the component are enabled, but start only the first time, enabled as many times as it happens that either one, the game object, the component, goes from disabled to enabled. So let's see that it is actually the case, because now what we do, we enable both of them from the very start. We enable them, okay? So what we expect is to see a couple of awake OnEnabled, then a couple of start, and then a couple of updates. In particular, it will execute awake and enabled of one of the two, then awake and OnEnable of the other one, then both starts, and then the first two of the updates of these two, and the other ones are not printed, but they would be there if we didn't filter them out. Again, awake OnEnabled of one of the two, I don't know which one it is, but one of the two prints awake enabled, OnEnable, awake OnEnabled, then both starts are done, and because start is internally they print the value of convex in the grounds mesh collider, so that they do that, and finally on update. So that's it. This is an actual guarantee. Every time we have awake and start, for instance, that are defined in multiple components over multiple game objects, all the awake functions are executed. Then all the start are executed. And this helps when we want to initialize things, but there are race conditions. So this is very useful, for instance, when we have some data members are just values, like a float and integer, so we initialize them in awake, whereas the references to either other game objects like ground or other components inside the game objects like mesh collider, we initialize them in start. In other words, the values we initialize them in awake. Basically, the local stuff we do it in awake, because all we need is that the game object is active. Whereas in start, we need that the component is actually awake together with all the others, so that they can take references to each other, right? And that's why we initialize the references in start. Usually we split it this way. Of course, if a class only has data or only has references, strictly speaking, you only need one or the other, right? But, you know, it's good to have this split, and it's kind of look neat. And on enable, instead we use it when we want something be done again and again every time an object goes, a component goes back to being enabled. And then disabled, you don't want it, and then back you want it again when it goes back enabled. That's something that start doesn't do, or awake. And all three of them are executed before the first time update is executed, for the first time. So all three, start, enable, and wake, are executed on all objects that are enabled when we press play, and then only then, for the first time, update is executed on any of them. So this means that we can initialize everything locally in awake or across different components and game object in start, and then we are ready, right? Everything is initialized, so we are ready to render the first frame, so we can execute update. I hope this is a lot to digest, but you can watch it a couple of times. There is also a link to another video that somebody else did in case you want to listen to a different person saying more or less the same things. I hope this helps, and that's enough for today.